Hello, and welcome to this sixth episode of When the Heart Leads. I am your host, Dr. Kate Newberg, founder of Books of Eden Publishing, and I am so excited to be with you today. The title of this episode is Falling in Love. And I do want to mention this episode, it might not be exactly what you're expecting because maybe when you hear the phrase falling in love, it definitely has some really specific connotations, especially in our culture. I want to mention up front, I'm going to be talking a lot about the universal experience of love and then how it expresses in the human form and also the ways, just to warn you, because this episode might feel at points like it's going into some pretty deep experiences, just the ways that love also is designed to break us open as humans. So I do talk about the ways that love expresses in relationship, but this is in a lot of ways an exploration of the universal force of love as it expresses through the human experience itself and what tends to happen when we allow ourselves to be opened by it. So go ahead and settle in. We're going to go on a bit of a journey as usual today. So going back to our one of the episodes where I talked about how we are slowed and stretched into linear time when we incarnate as humans. Right? We experience time as linear, and what ends up happening is that we start to talk about our experience, make sense of our experience through narrative, through stories. And as we know, stories become populated by characters. And in the human experience, as we look back at the kind of the expression of humanity over time, these characters are expressed through archetypes oftentimes. And so we have this, I want to mention this sweet and poignant experience. Like, we know our stories are precious, right? So as we come here to live the story. And we know these stories are precious, and within and through these stories is woven the experience of love itself. And as we'll talk about, every archetype is some sort of constellated expression of love. And then there are some archetypes like the lovers, like the king and queen, or the mother and child that are very oriented explicitly around love. And we're going to talk about that. But kind of the declaration of this episode is really that humans were born to love and to express love, right? And we have come to experience, to live through oftentimes these archetypes as specific expressions of love in relationship. And so we will talk about that. There are, I believe, many misconceptions about love, what love is. And oftentimes, especially in our culture with a lot of the prevailing messages of love, we can mistake attachment for love or need for love, right? And so ultimately, I want to bring forward my experience, my understanding of love in the human experience as I've lived my life, and how love has worked with and through me to break me open again and again and again. And so in this way, I believe that true love, we could say true love or unconditional love, it's actually, I called it a vast and terrifying thing. And it's actually something that many of us spend our lives kind of running from a little bit. And this is because when love enters, when love really decides to come in, it is... it can be a ruthless, you can experience it almost as a ruthless force, because it inexorably clears everything within us that is small, you could say, or clinging, or weak, and any part of us that feels weak, that's not the weakness itself. That's not an expression of our highest self, right? So it clears those things, and that can be really scary. And so oftentimes love then will reveal these archetypes that we live within, that we play within, that we express through, right? As merely a signpost, like as they say in Zen, the finger pointing to the moon. These archetypes that we inhabit as human beings, and this love transcends all thought, all attachment, anything that is small and petty and bound. This love, true love, universal love, infinite love, it transcends it. This love I'm talking about, we conceive of it almost sometimes as a thought form. Oftentimes we use our brain first. So this love, we think we know what it is, but it can't be thought of. And I understand the irony of speaking of it, because it can't even really be spoken of. When it's truly irradiating you, it's something that is lived. It's something that emanates from you. It enters you as an unmistakable presence, and then it becomes the guiding energy of your life, of who you are on this planet as you walk. And so this is not a small experience. This is often not a comfortable experience when we experience love. And I'm going to mention in a moment the time that I felt unconditional love for the first time, like really felt it in my body beyond thought form, beyond what my brain could conceive of. And I want to mention something, again, real quick, because we're about to go into a couple things, ways that I've interpreted them. Very quick disclaimer, if you're just tuning in for the first time, this is not a religious podcast. I do not ascribe to any dogma or specific religion, but I do draw from wisdom traditions, and oftentimes from the wisdom tradition of, in our Western culture, the Bible, the Torah, these biblical stories, because they are deeply archetypal visions and images that point to a deep truth of our humanity. And they are also stories that underpin our experience of the world, even if we've never set foot in a church or a temple or a synagogue. These stories are very much intertwined, embedded in our culture. And so I address them often as sources of wisdom, as stories, as archetypal images, as visions that are deeply and recursively human. So if you hear me talking about figures in these wisdom traditions like Jesus or Mother Mary or Moses, all these things, it's not because I'm ascribing to a dogma, but because I'm bringing their teachings forward in a way that I believe can illuminate the larger point. So just, again, I make this disclaimer in most of my podcast episodes, just so you know. So I do want to bring forward a saying that Jesus had, which was, it was suffer the angels to enter you. And this seems like a strange thing to say because they're angels. How could it be suffering? But there is, as we're going to see, kind of almost like a type of suffering that happens when love enters us. And sometimes I think about it as, I grew up in Minnesota, so I have experienced frostbite far too many times. And when you experience frostbite, and I use this image a lot, like when the blood flows back into that frozen limb, it hurts. It's very painful. It's like this life force entering, expanding, the blood vessels, all these things, expanding everything to accommodate life force again. And this is often what happens when we suffer love to enter us. It irradiates the parts of us that have been constricted, and that can feel uncomfortable sometimes. So when Jesus says, suffer the angels to enter you, like it can be a form of suffering. And we're going to talk about that more in this episode. And so I want to mention just a quick story of the first time I felt the presence of unconditional love in my body, and it became embedded in my very cells as a somatic experience. And it was it was during a medicine ceremony, and I had that week for some reason, been bombarded with messages and images and things that really brought to the surface, brought to my awareness the suffering of children on earth and the kind of the brutalities that can be committed against children, which is one of the abominations of kind of the human, like one of those deeply disorienting confrontations of what humans are capable of toward these innocent beings. And so I was really holding that in this medicine ceremony, and I had a lot of questions around, what is this? How could this happen? Like, how could humans express this way? And in that ceremony, I was taken onto the lap of the Divine Mother, and I experience her as Mother Mary. But we can bring in any expression of the Divine Mother that we want. I experience her as Mother Mary, and I was taken onto her lap. And first I experienced the deep irradiation of her love. And it was, and I had all these questions, essentially lots and lots of different forms of the question, like, well, do you really love me? And can you love me when I'm angry? And can you love me when I'm upset? And can you love me when I'm suffering? And can you love me when I'm petty? And can you love me? All these different things. And I just kept getting the message, like, you are my precious child. I will always love you. I will never turn away from you. You can always turn to me. You can always turn to me. And that went on for a long time, because many of us have experienced that kind of love that turns away from us, that needs us to be a certain way, to express in a certain way, to receive love. And that's a deep, deep pain, a deep wound that we experience when someone's gotten angry or impatient with us, and we feel, oh, it must be my fault. I'm expressing in the wrong way. I need to express in this way to experience love. And that was a deep cleansing with Mother Mary, because she never turned away from me, no matter how needy I felt. All those things that people get, they're too needy, they're too clingy, they're too whatever. All those things, like, especially as a child, we might experience that, having needs, our needs not being met, our needs being seen as a burden, all these things all that got washed away, because in that moment, Mother Mary reassured again and again and again that she would never turn away from me in my suffering. She would always be there for me. So that got deeply embedded. And then I started asking her questions about the suffering of the world. And I said, what about all of the children who are being hurt? What about them? And she, without hesitation, she just said, they're all my precious children. They're all my precious children. I love all of them. They're all my precious children. And then I asked the question I was afraid to ask, because I said, this is going to be the threshold of love. This is going to be where she turns away. This is going to be the limit, the upper limit, of unconditional love. I'm about to experience it right now. And I said, what about the ones that are doing the hurting? And without hesitation, she said, they're all my precious children. You are all my precious children. And that moment, I got in my body what it means to experience, to know unconditional love, love that has nothing to do with our actions on earth. And that's kind of that. And of course, and if you go back and listen to our episode on soul healing, we'll know that just because we experience this expression of unconditional love doesn't mean, all sorts of things. It doesn't mean that those people who enact brutality belong in our lives. It doesn't mean that, that we invite them to dinner, right? It doesn't mean any of that, right? It just means there is, through us, the possibility of loving all beings on earth as divine children. And we're going to talk more and more about that as this episode progresses. Again, I kind of see these episodes sometimes as like I'm walking through an orchard or a garden, and I'm picking this, picking that, picking this flower, and I have finally this offering, a bouquet or, a constellation of offerings that all kind of come through into this understanding. And for this episode, the understanding that is falling in love and what that means as a human. And so this is an expression of unconditional love that we are capable of as humans. Every human is capable of this, of seeing all beings as divine children, no matter what. That unconditional expression, that's possible. And I'm going to pivot for a moment. So holding that possibility, that knowing, that expression, humans have come here to love, right? What that means. I want to pivot for a moment and talk about the way there's this universal love. There's this overarching love that we exist within. It's always available to us through the sanctity of our heart, which knows how to love unconditionally. And then there is also so there's that infinite unconditional love. Then there's also the expression of love in accepting ourselves as a finite form, which of course comes with the understanding of death. That as an incarnated being in form, we will experience that. And so these two forces, love, infinite love, and death, are in many ways inextricable. They walk side by side. If we're going to incarnate, if we're going to take on this experience of incarnating into form, then we're accepting the ephemeral nature of it, right? And so this love walks side by side with the knowledge that when we express in form, through form, toward form, eventually it's going to go away. This form, the love stays. We know that. But this ache of knowing that this love that we have with this person in this relationship right now is totally unique and irreplaceable and will one day be gone. Like that specific expression will one day dissolve. And so there's both this universal love and also this unique, irreplaceable type of love that exists in form, between form. And that's beautiful. That's part of the story we came here to live, right? And so this is the expression, falling in love. Every single person, being that we come across, there will be a different expression of that love that expresses, as I'm going to say, it refracts through our very complex being and the moment, the context in which we are standing, right? And so I'm going to read an excerpt that really helps, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and when I write something, it's kind of the refined understanding. Take a quick drink of water. It's this refined understanding of the thing I'm trying to get at. And sometimes I just read it because I already kind of got to this point, right, to be able to express it. So I'm going to read an excerpt right now from my first book, The New Eden Paradise Retold. And this excerpt really starts to bring to light what it means to hold this infinite love, this unconditional love, while living as a soul in a finite form, and what that means and how that brings us to our breaking. And so I'm just going to read this because it expresses that really well. If you're following along, if you have the book and you're following along, we're on page 112. And this section is called The Power of the Heart. And so I wrote, "It is a quaking thing to feel the infinite move through the finite medium of our bodies. When we open to it, we find not that nothing matters, but that everything matters so much that we cannot ever hope to contain it. In the vast presence of our own relentless light, we are broken open. This is crucifixion, to finally surrender to the shattering cosmic power of holding love in a body that can only live and breathe and walk for this short while. To love deeply that which will someday be gone is the unbearable ache of our existence. It is the threshold of tenderness, the final turning toward that which matters above all else. In a culture that denies death, we tend to forget that which is truly precious to us. We spend our time trying to elude, outwit, and outmaneuver death instead of allowing it to guide us toward those things it cannot touch. Death will come, but in this moment, it cannot take away the sun on my face, the river rushing below my feet, the songbird flitting like joy in the branches of the oak. Death holds tenderly a container for all that is fleeting in the human experience. In the face of that cosmic truth, our fears seem very small and very far away indeed. When we truly contemplate death, we begin to turn towards that which we can see, feel, touch. We break open into a flourishing explosion of light so vast it cannot be contained or directed toward that person or that thing. We become like the sun itself, shining the burning countenance of our love onto all that we meet. So I mention as well, and I'm going to read this next part as well, even though we're not going to go into it too much because it is perhaps a response to what you might be feeling right now. And I say, in a culture that defines love as exclusive, channeled only through specific relationships and largely sexual urges, feeling this overwhelming tenderness toward all beings can be at first bewildering. Perhaps it is even more bewildering to those who encounter it, thinking somehow that the emanating love they receive is personal. Many, those who have not yet uncovered their own taproot to source, will want instinctively to co-opt, control, contain, or claim the person offering this love, like a freezing person trying to possess fire. And then one more thing before we move on. I said to command in a finite body the infinite power of love for creation and transmutation, we must learn to simultaneously penetrate and surrender to the mystery of our heart. So that, right, I know there was a lot there. And so we're going to kind of unpick that a little bit. And we won't spend, in that part where I mentioned, right, the bewildering aspect where many people who experience, when you begin to emanate this unconditional love and know that it exists at all times for all people, right, it can be very bewildering to those who have not yet been irradiated in that way, and they might try to possess or co-opt it. And I understand that that is that's a whole other part of this love. Like, as we begin to claim this universal love, we also create boundaries alongside of it. And that, again, I address more in the episode on soul healing, where you can begin to use language to create those boundaries while loving at the same time, right? And so I do want to mention that, because you might be, if you're triggered, if you've been that person who's been in love and expressed love and been kind of people have tried to co-opt or control it, you might feel really triggered right now. So I want to mention that's a thing, and I understand it. But right now we're going to go more into what it means to really allow that pure expression of love, of unconditional love, what it means to break us open, so that holding tenderly of all that is finite in the human experience, right? Allowing death to be that guide, you could say. And we can see now that there is, when we hold that infinite love in a finite form, there is an opening that happens where the unconditional divine love of, you could say, God or the universe or whatever, is how you receive it. That love irradiates you. And then as it irradiates you, right, and you're broken open, your perfect presence, in your perfect presence, you begin to walk the earth as a living sun, irradiating this love that you feel that is you. And so as you walk, no matter what, just breathing, just being, right, lifts those around you into light, and fear dissolves, right? And this process, though, this movement into this larger force where all these conceptions, all these attachments, all these things that are small and clinging break down, dissolve, right? That's the true death that happens, right? That's the gift of death, that it allows things to come to an end that are finite, that need to come to an end, so that the larger expression can begin to take shape in us, through us. But it can be terrifying in some ways, because it means that we offer ourselves up to be broken open by this unbearable ache of loving that which is only walking the earth for this short while, because it expresses, as humans, we've come here for that expression. We've come here to express through the archetypes. We haven't come to just be this remote universal love. We've come to experience it in relationship, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. But when we enter into this plane of existence, we begin to understand, and this sometimes happens after the fact, long after the grieving, after the healing, we understand we have come here to be broken open. That broken open, that breaking is the movement of our apotheosis. It's the mechanism of our apotheosis, you could say, as we merge into greater and greater expressions of our being, into our divine expression. That breaking open is the mechanism of our apotheosis. And so when you come here, there is just a knowing eventually that life will find a way to break you. And this breaking, there can often be one huge breaking that happens, and I'll talk about what that was for me. But oftentimes there is also just many, many, many instances of breaking when it's just time to release, to let something go. And eventually you recognize it, and the mastery comes when you begin to offer yourself up to this breaking. You begin to recognize that it's upon you. And then you begin to say, okay, this is that moment of surrender where something larger than me needs to come in. This limb is frozen. It needs to be irradiated with life force. And I think I know it's going to hurt. And I still am going to offer myself up to this breaking. And I wrote, there's a part, again, in my first book, and I'm just drawing a line from it. This is that from the teaching of devotion. I say devotion is relentless. It expands you beyond your boundaries until you break. And you breathe and you break again. You break until you have no choice but to become divine. It is the only thing that breaks without shattering. So you allow yourself to become divine. That's that movement of apotheosis, that mechanism of apotheosis. And the more you allow your divinity to be the emanation of your being, the more you can break and break without shattering. It's a breaking that becomes a release. And even though it can hurt, even though there's grieving involved, it becomes a release. And so it takes, and so your heart knows this, by the way. Your heart knows how to do this. This is something that comes by degrees as your heart brings you into this human experience. And it takes the relentlessness of your inner love to break you open. And I will say that I have done all sorts of things. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. I personally have done all sorts of things to shore myself up against this breaking, because it can be Like, you're like, do I really want the blood to come back into this limb? I know it's going to hurt. So I've done all sorts of things, but it always got me in the end. It always got me in the end. And I will say that one of my biggest breakings, perhaps my biggest breaking in this lifetime, that opened me into kind of that realm of being where those fears seem so far away and small. This, for me, in this lifetime, that breaking came in the form of a miscarriage. And it was the purest love I had ever known. And also, I felt, this soul that left me before I was ready to let it go. And it was a huge surrender, because there was nothing else to do, because it had already gone. The soul had gone. And so I think that this soul came to break me open, to teach me how to grieve, and that this was an act of devotion beyond anything I could conceive of. And I came to understand it in this way after a long time. I came to understand it in this way of a gift that I would never have chosen, right? But that was also a deep gift of this breaking open. And I did write about this, the fierceness of this surrender and what it means to move through it. And I'm going to read another passage here, and this is kind of addresses that. And it's called The Secret. Beneath the Secret is this passage. And this is a passage from my memoir, which is called Finding Home, a Mystical Memoir. And this kind of, there's a way I conceive in some ways of this apotheosis, of this merging. And in this passage, it takes the form of what it means to become a mountain. And that is, that's how I bring it in here, because that helped me really express what it means to go from the small self into that divine apotheosis, and the process of that. What can be can be on one side of it. When you're on the other side of it, it just is. But then before you've entered in, before the blood has entered that limb, right, the beholding that process can be very terrifying to the small self. And so I'm going to read this because it helps kind of bring us through what that breaking is and what it feels like to move through it, and then also to be merged on the other side. And so I'm going to read this. If you have the book and you want to follow along, we are starting on page 69 in the passage, The Secret Beneath the Secret. And here I will read just a part of this passage. So, also I mentioned in here a ceremony. That was another ceremony where I had finally allowed myself to break open into the grief of losing this this being, this soul. And so so when I mention the ceremony, that's what I'm talking about, and that's a whole other passage. There's a lot that happens before this, but let's go in. So I wrote, I thought all my life that I needed to climb mountains, to conquer them. But that was just my smallness, the little ant that was me trying to stand somewhere so it could feel big. The little ant that needed something to do. The little ant that needed something, anything, to distract it from the force that it could sense was waiting just on the other side of stillness. This ant knew that the nameless force would obliterate it, so it kept busy, exhausting itself, knowing it couldn't stop, not for 1 second. In that ceremony of my awakening, the ant washed away. It died, and its little bones became subsumed into the mountain. So it became the mountain, just as I had. I saw, in fact, that I had been the mountain all along. I know it now. I know it finally today. I have lived in, on, and around mountains, The little ant that was me climbed them in all seasons, in all weather, on all sorts of contraptions. I have felt everything they have to offer: fear, exhilaration, exhaustion, despair, frustration, resolution, triumph, hollowness, disappointment, pain, wonder, awe. I have loved and hated them, these mountains. But now I am the mountain, and all else has fallen away. When you become the mountain, you must accept that you are massive. You are exposed. You can be seen for miles. You beckon the wild, wondering hearts of all who behold you. What would it be like, you seem to say by your very presence, to stand at the top of me? What would it be like to know me? As the mountain, you become the target of all their feelings, the ones that climb you, the ones that don't, the ones that succeed, the ones that fail. You stand as a challenge to all who behold you, whether they choose to walk your paths or not. Those that don't, they cry, I am weak, I am afraid, I don't need to climb a dumb mountain. And they spend their lives wondering what they missed. Those that do embark declare, I am strong, I am determined, I am an adventurer, I am better than those who are too spiritless to try. Regardless, each of them who beholds the mountain sees it as a separate thing. In this way, their lives become tethered to the mountain and all it kindles in them. It is the mountain that is doing this to me, they cry. It is the mountain that makes me feel this way. They fall in love, they hate you, they pound on you in despair. Sometimes they die, and those who are left to grieve blame you. To be a mountain is to stir the untamed, unnameable longings of others simply by existing. To be a mountain means to be seen for miles and miles, and also to hold secrets that few can penetrate. To be a mountain means to have a peak that only the very strongest can summit. To be a mountain is to be a secret living in plain sight. The mountain, still and silent, shows you the secret beneath the secret. I am you, says the mountain. You are me. But to know this, you must bear the unbearable. You must feel the vastness of your longing. You must feel it fully all the way to your breaking. The mountain is the beckoning of death. It is an invitation to lose yourself in its fathomless mass. As it juts upwards into the sky that was made exactly big enough to hold it, the mountain beckons you into the contours of your own life. Until you do this, there will be a part of you that can never rest. Whether you look or whether you look away, it is the same. Whether you climb or walk away, it is the same. As long as you think you are the looker, the climber, the adventurer, the failure, you will be looking, climbing, seeking, failing. Until you stop climbing and start becoming, you will know only a life of unconsummated yearning. To become the mountain, though, you must know it. You must understand the mountain so fully that it finally reveals its name. Only then can you become it. And once you become it, you forget the name, because there is no need to remember something that you already are. I'll skip to the end just to come back. I wrote, my daughter didn't have a name. I never knew it. But I do know this. I came here because I had to know what she would feel like growing inside of me. She taught me how to walk slowly the mountain paths. She taught me to love my body as it stretched and grew to carry her. And at the last, she taught me how to grieve. How beautiful, how simple, how wonderful is that? So there's this play happening here that is kind of emerging as the theme of this podcast episode, where we become the mountain. We merge into this apotheosis. We merge into this divinity. And also, like at the end, I was still walking the mountain paths, right? I'm still beholding, being at the same time. And that's if you go back to the teachings of the dragonfly, one of the teachings of the dragonfly that I mentioned, I think in the first episode, the dragonfly transcends the element of water, begins in the element of water, transcends to the element of air, and still plays. Once it's transcended, it still comes back to play in that water. You see it dipping in and out. They land on the water. They hover over it. They dip in and out. They're still within that. They still play within that element. And this is what happens when we break open, we break into blossom, we merge with this divine, the mechanism of our apotheosis, and then we still learn to express through the archetypes of form, through the relationships that exist. Instead of pushing them away, we begin to play within them. We merge both in that divine, eternal apotheosis of our being. Then we come back and we're able to take that to our form and live the human experience fully with all of its joy and all of its suffering and all of its grief. And that is what happens when we merge, when we transcend. We don't go beyond this human experience. What actually happens is that we begin to feel it fully. And when we fall in love, deeply in love with the world, with humanity, with this or that person or this or that thing, right? Any mechanism, any way the divine needs to reach us, it will, through this relationship, that relationship. It will learn to break us open, and it will come to break us open. And suddenly when that happens, that breaking happens, it doesn't mean that we are lifted up and out beyond suffering. What it means, and in some ways we are, but what I've found is that suddenly there exist no barriers between you and the world, between me and the world. And so suddenly, like that limb that was frozen, that was numb, right? We may have found ways as that little ant to be distracted, to numb ourselves out through whatever it is. Maybe it's our addictions, whatever our addictions are, whatever our attachments are. We numb ourselves out from the world so we don't have to feel the irradiation of this life force that is suffering the divine to enter us. And we can only go so far before we break eventually. Suffering itself is a mechanism that comes to its own breaking point, right? So it's always leading us to that one way or another. And what happens is that we begin to feel everything. And when this first happened to me, the very first awakening I had, and I've been broken open a number of times, the very first, I felt like, I think I mentioned this, like the skin underneath a fingernail, like that had been torn away. I felt so tender. I felt so deeply everything around me that I couldn't calibrate to. It took me a long time to calibrate to that. And I wanted to shut off, but there were no mechanisms of numbing anymore. They were all gone all at once. So I felt everything. What I really felt deeply, that irradiation was the suffering. I was suffering the angels to enter me. And this still happens, by the way. So even after that one massive breaking, those number of, like, you could say a series of massive breakings that happened sometimes still I can go into that little ant and I can try to distract myself and I can forget. And when that happens, I'm starting to recognize that, okay, I'm coming into this place. I'm starting to there's this attachment, that attachment, maybe a deep suffering that I need to address, but I don't want to address it right now. I don't want the light to come in. I'm just going to distract myself. And eventually the universe will always find a way to break me open again and into that love, into that deep tenderness. And that actually happened this past week. Just a very quick story, just because I feel like it's relevant. It brings it down to this concrete level, right? And a daily level, right? Like we don't need to go through something like a death or a miscarriage every single time we need to be broken open. There can be something smaller that fully breaks us. Smaller, you could say, but still just as poignant. So I had been feeling all week like that little ant this past week. I don't know about you guys. I've been feeling it. And I was like distracting myself and I was getting caught up on things and I saw myself doing it. And I knew it was eventually building toward a breaking and I didn't know what form that breaking would take. And then one day I felt this really weird urge to go to a building that I knew would be closed. I knew would be locked. And I accepted that urge. I was like, something's there for me. Maybe, there'll be someone there who can let me in to the place I want to go and, whatever. But I listened to it and I actually broke a ritual that I have. And I left and I went and I said, okay, I need to go now. And I listened, I went. And sure enough, the place that I wanted to go was locked. And I was standing in this lobby like, what am I doing here? And I turn around and there's a man behind me. And he's a man who I had met before a couple of times, and there he was, but he looked different. He was hunched and wan and exhausted in his shoulders, and he'd shrunk in on himself, and I almost didn't recognize him. And I said, what is going on with you? Like, hi. And I recognized, there's, how did we both appear at this lobby at the same time? This is what I was brought here for. And he went into this long, rambling story of pain and suffering, how he spent it was this, and I understood as I was listening, I understood that this was an expression of deep human suffering, that he had spent all this time, like 5 nights in jail, and he had just gotten out and he hadn't gotten any sleep and he didn't have anywhere to go. And as I was listening to this, I felt the depth of this suffering of this human being who I know going all the way back to this divine child of humanity, right? Who is beloved of the mother, deeply beloved of the mother. And I felt it in my body, his suffering, the depth of it. And suddenly all the things that I'd been like the little ant that was me that was trying to keep busy around and I understood how insignificant they were in the face of this. And there was, of course, the part of me that wanted to alleviate the suffering, that wanted to do something, take action, right? That's another part of us. We experience this suffering and we want to take action immediately to make it go away. And in that moment, I understood that is not what I was being called to do. I was being called to hold the suffering, to listen, to say what it was I could, and to know that there was maybe nothing I could do that could alleviate it, nothing I could do to fix it. And so I was just in the face of it, being called to hold it, to witness, to feel everything. And he spoke all these things, these speakings of suffering, and then ran out the door. And the interaction was done, and there was this, and I was left with the holding of it. And I just broke open from that, from the deep, heartfelt connection of a human being who was suffering. And it broke me open. And everything that was small that I'd been clinging to just fell away, was shown to be as insignificant as it really is in the face of this. And I allowed that to be a gift. And I understand how callous that must sound in some ways, to for the experience of someone else's suffering to be a gift, I allowed that to be the gift that I knew was, that he had given me a gift beyond measure to witness and hold that, and to remember, to be broken open in that love, and to remember what was really important here, what really mattered. And so there's this universal love, and then there's the way it expresses in relationship. And there is, of course, a deep irony, kind of a paradox, that our first turning of love, our first experience of love, our most solid experience of love is that love we have for the self, the relationship we have for the self. And I think I talk about that one in, one of the episodes I think I talk about. It might even be that same episode of Soul Healing, which seems really connected to this one. And we feel that first. We are irradiated with self-love. I am a divine child. And then we understand as well that as a human incarnating into form, right, that love, while it exists in this infinite, eternal form, it also needs to express through these archetypes, through relationships, and that intangible connection that we have, that exists between us and others. And I will say just really quickly, the heart itself is interconnected with all beings. It's like, if you know Indra's net, like we are a network of hearts, and this intangible connection, it already exists. It already does exist. There's no way to sever it. There's no way to cut it. There's no way to snap it, right? All the beings on earth, all the beings in the universe, we are connected to inextricably. That's the way the heart operates. We're part of a larger interconnected web. Right. And as I'm going to say, that doesn't mean that, like, so us and those people who are causing suffering, those brutality, there is a thread that exists between us. And our role in many ways is to allow that thread to just be light. We can't cut it. We can't cut them off. We can't deny it. So we allow that thread to exist because it already does. And it doesn't mean we invite them over to dinner. It doesn't mean we try to save them, right? It just means we allow that connection to exist, us and all beings on the planet, right? And through that connection, right, we begin to, with the ones that are truly, we can allow to be inflowing, the connections that inflow to us, we understand that we cannot be nourished as human beings by a remote and abstract love. And this is what it means to come down from the mountain. We spent this time refining our being, allowing this channel with the divine, allowing ourselves to shore up our inner self-love, our divine love of the self. And then we come down from the mountain and we begin to exist in communion with other beings. And we begin to acknowledge and feel that deep heart connection that exists anyway. And we begin to allow ourselves to be nourished by those connections. And those exist, they express through these archetypes. We maybe the archetype of lover, the archetype of mother and child, the archetype of king and queen, and then these archetypes that exist in relationship begin to express through us in connection, and is present here and now, and we receive it. And our souls are playing in these archetypes, right? We know our souls, we incarnate, and we're incarnating, okay, this lifetime will be mother and child, and we're going to play through those archetypes. And the love is always pure, but it gets filtered through this complexity of our experience and the complexity of our relationships, right? What ends up happening as we refine this love, as we begin to remove the attachments that we might feel, right, that come with these archetypes: lover, child, mother, grandparent, sovereign, right? We begin to acknowledge the purity of that connection, even as we exist and play through those archetypes, through those relationships. And we allow ourselves to be nourished by them. And I do want to mention, because we do exist in relationship with all beings, and there are those beings that have chosen to express cruelty, brutality, right? And we will learn that when we try to cut them off, deny their existence, deny our connection to them as humans, we're actually cutting off a part of ourselves. We're trying to put something in place that is not true. Because what is true is that we are inextricably have a heart connection with them no matter what. And so what ends up happening, right? So coming back just briefly, I mentioned it in the passage in The Power of the Heart, where those some people try to co-opt, possess our love, control our love, right? When they feel it emanating. And they don't have their own taproot to source yet. They haven't uncovered that yet, which exists for them. But there's nothing we can make. We can't make it happen. We can't fix it. All we can do is behold it, right? What happens is that we do, and I'm drawing from Ram Dass, who talks about this. He says, do what you must do to another being, with another being, but never put them from your heart. We might need to close the door. We might need to block them. We might need to cut off communication. We might need to say this person has no place in the open connections where I am receiving light. This person is not someone I'm going to receive from. Right? But we let the connection exist as is. We don't cut off the connection. We never put them from our heart. We never deny that they are an infinite divine child, beloved by the mother. We never deny that. But we do what we need to do for ourselves within that, right? This connection exists. It's a heart thread. I know that you're beloved of the divine, but I can't fix or change you. You are not, this connection is not open for receiving, right? I know it exists. It's just a passive thread of light. And that's it. And you cut off all attachment. That's what you snap. You snip it. When you cut that cord, all the attachments dissolve, but the thread of light still exists, and it's just purity, just pure light. I acknowledge you're a divine being. You're never from my heart. You don't belong in my life. That kind of thing, right? So that exists too. That exists too as we begin to explore this Indra's net, our inherent interconnectedness. But what happens as we begin to embrace this, right, this universal light as it expresses through us as finite beings, is we allow that very finiteness, if that's a word, but the ever-present kind of understanding that this is just a moment in time that is fleeting. We allow that expression of our heart to be present in every interaction, in that every interaction is an opportunity to express, to amplify this light. And so we may feel it expressing through these archetypes, right? To fall deeply in love as a lover is a wonderful human experience. And to allow that to be an expression of divine light is a wonderful human experience. To allow the archetype of parent and child to express is a beautiful human experience and part of the story, right? And ultimately we find mother, lover, friend, this is pure light becomes refracted through the unique, irreplaceable expression of these two coming together. And so each moment shifts like an unearthly kaleidoscope. This moment, our love, this love expressing through the complexity of our form, refracted through the complexity of our form in this moment where we stand with all the context around us. This is the ever-shifting kaleidoscope. We cannot track it. We cannot make sense of it. It gets to the point where we can only behold it. We surrender into it. And that is love. That is divine surrender. That is the breaking open into blossom, where every moment in this connection, this being, that being, this moment, this season, this day, this minute, everything around us, my unique expression in this moment, your unique expression in this moment coming together, that is the divine dance, the poignant, fascinating, kaleidoscopic experience of this human expression. Absolutely rich in every moment. And we hold all of it at once. When we fall in love and all these barriers are removed, we hold it at once. This person walks to me in suffering. This person walks to me in joy, and I can meet them in all of it because I have been broken open into love. And this coming up, this is unscripted right now, but the something I want to mention here that's coming up is that's ultimately the upwelling of compassion. And I call compassion, I say compassion is the ultimate intelligence, because compassion, that deep heart-centered connection with any other human being, allows us to meet them in whatever it is that they present to us. And we meet them there and we choose what to do with it. Maybe it's just holding, just listening, right? The holding and the listening, the reception of suffering without fixing it, changing it, knowing that you are a divine being, I'm a divine being, we're here, we're refracted, we're this right now. The ultimate intelligence of compassion. That's, in some ways, that's what we're talking about here. How that exists in relationship. So falling in love, allowing the infinite experience of our infinite divine self to express through the complexity of our humanity, of our form, and letting that be then amplified in complexity with other forms, other beings, in all the ways, and to always come back, to allow these connections to break us open in larger and larger and larger expressions of our divinity. To learn to hold all of it, all at once. To fall in love with everyone we meet and allow that expression to be just what it needs to be at all times. That is the deep wisdom and compassion of holding the infinite in a finite form. That is the offering of ourselves up into this breaking open, this breaking into blossom, this irradiation of divine light into our being, so that it can express and express and express. And finally, we know we have come here to love. And that is our highest purpose. And to allow that love to take whatever form it needs to take, so that we can be nourished in this form and in our divinity all at once. Falling in love. Oh. This has been the 6th episode of When the Heart Leads. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Newberg, and it has been just such an honor to connect with you across time and space, and to share this connection, knowing that we have that as well. From my heart to yours, till next time.